Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first session of the GCAT Colloquium series for the summer semester. I'm Anthony Maluso. I'm one of the PhD candidates here at the HCA. And first want to say thank you to the HCA and the DFG for funding and hosting this session on authority and trust. We'll have a whole bunch of interesting lectures coming up over the course of the semester. And check the calendar. They're not all on Thursday this semester as they have been in the past. They happen on different days. But look forward to seeing you all at the many interesting sessions that we have. I have the pleasure of introducing Professor Daniel Souleles today. And Daniel is an anthropologist that teaches at the Copenhagen Business School. I'm excited to welcome Daniel here tonight for some selfish reasons. As an American living in Europe, people often ask me why the American healthcare system is horrible. I can respond that every American that I know would like to see some healthcare reform, but why this doesn't happen, I can't really explain. So enter Daniel as backup. As an anthropologist, Daniel has embedded himself in a place where people have the power and ostensibly the interest to change American healthcare, the Massachusetts state legislature. He's embedded himself there in order to investigate. And this is one of the themes of tonight's lecture, titled, Why Trust the Process? Avoiding Democracy in Massachusetts. Now, Daniel has built a career out of unveiling processes behind everyday conundrums. Daniel stumbled across one such mystery while conducting fieldwork with Catholic hermit monks. When he learned that they were being taken over by a private equity fund, he pivoted to learn about the people behind private equity and why their influence was showing up in so much of American life as the new managers of daycares, restaurants, and even monasteries. This put Daniel in a position of studying powerful people, often people that don't want to be studied. Through persistent and innovative efforts, though, Daniel has published 2 enlightening ethnographic accounts on Wall Street. One book titled Songs of Profit, Songs of Loss, Private Equity, Investing in New York City, and the other one is Whoosh Goes the Market, Algorithms, Automation, and Alienation. Daniel has converted these hard-won field lessons into methods for anthropologists as well. He's published some useful advice and some hot takes, challenging conventional wisdom on how to and the ethics of studying powerful people. I first encountered Daniel's work on how anthropologists could better connect with other disciplines. Publishing in Current Anthropology, the discipline's flagship journal, Daniel argued for how and why anthropologists could become more trustworthy transdisciplinary collaborators through transparent, systematic analysis, showing the receipts is one of his arguments. In this sense, Daniel has been a role model for me, but this is just the beginning of an exciting career, and more of which I'm sure you'll hear about tonight. So please join me in welcoming Daniel Souleles.
That was an exceptionally generous introduction. Thank you very much. I'll tell my mother about it. She'll be very happy to hear it. Can you hear me okay? Is the microphone working? All right, great. Okay, so my name is Daniel Souleles. I'm an anthropologist and associate professor at the Copenhagen Business School. I study politics, economics, and value in the contemporary United States. And thank you very much to the Center for American Studies and Anthony Maluso for having me here today. It's a real honor to be here. Thank you. So today I'm going to talk to you about democracy in the United States and specifically why it doesn't work terribly well. At the outset, I suppose I should acknowledge that anyone with an internet connection is likely both aware of the state of democracy in the United States and has a few pretty good theories as to why it is dysfunctional, which actually puts me in somewhat unusual territory for an anthropologist. We're used to being merchants of weirdness and wonder, bringing you some facet of the human experience that only I and half a dozen people in some hinterland have ever seen. So much for that. So given all that, let me be a little bit more specific. What I hope to do today is review the argument from a book manuscript that I'm currently revising for a university press, an ethnographic monograph called Avoiding Democracy in Massachusetts, an American Picaresque, which itself is based on several years of ethnographic fieldwork on the state legislature in Massachusetts, one of the United States' 50 states. There is a lovely Wikipedia-approved map that is surprisingly enthusiastic about bodies of water, and that is the state capital of Massachusetts, at the top of Beacon Hill. What I'm going to suggest is that in a liberal democracy, that is a polity dedicated to both popular sovereignty on the one hand and universal rights on the other, even extending to various minorities. In a liberal democracy, governing elites make certain explicit and tacit promises to represent the will of the governed as part of its operation and ongoing claims to legitimacy. Keeping those promises in turn requires a rather complex and interrelated set of social institutions, things like a free press, good general education, an independent judiciary, and so on, all of which, in one way or another, are predicated on the open operation of the legislative process. And this is the key node through which everything else passes. The legislative process, of course, is the process by which politicians are elected and then draft, debate, and pass laws and policies. So today I'm going to walk through the various historically specific frailties in the legislative process in Massachusetts that have made it so that it is increasingly difficult for politicians to keep those democratic promises. Specifically, I will suggest that a culture of avoidance, it's an empty office from the State House, has grown up around politics in Massachusetts, whereby politicians avoid deliberating with one another, avoid taking public stances on issues, avoid taking recorded votes, and even avoid making firm, actionable commitments to their constituents. More to the point, this culture of avoidance is not a static, immutable quality of Massachusetts or democratic governance. Rather, it has a ratcheting dynamic, whereby rank-and-file politicians become ever more marginalized and leadership ever more powerful. Under these conditions, democracy becomes less and less the liberal idol I sketched above, and becomes more and more exclusively a simple, majoritarian exercise in the ratification of authority, which is a bit of a bummer. In any event, to do all of this, I'm going to start by explaining a bit more about my background and how I found my way to legislatures. And then I'm going to step back and give you an overview of the fieldwork, research methods, data that made up the project. Then I will introduce an example of political and legislative avoidance wherein politicians avoid scrutiny of their decisions. This will give you the opportunity to reflect on the deep and profound question of whether you think school children should be provided lunch. Then I will walk you through the key empirical findings around avoidance, as well as a tour of the other sections of the book. All of this will build to a big discussion about why politicians in Massachusetts don't pass universal health care. So I'm going to give you some ammunition next time you're at a party defending your nationality, Anthony. Or whatever you do about your nationality. I don't know that you're defending it. Despite their constituents wanting it. And then finally, I'll conclude with some recommendations on how to break this spiral. This book is actually written in kind of an activist lens. So while it is a theoretically informed monograph, the conclusion is not like a big argument about how to think about democracy. Rather, it's given these anthropologically identified frailties, what interventions could break this type of spiral. So it's kind of an ethically motivated book, and I look forward to talking about that in the conclusion. Okay, so background. Boop. Oh yeah, school lunches. This is what school lunches look like in Massachusetts. So depending on how you feel about this food, maybe you do or don't want them. I don't know. Okay, as I alluded to before, I'm an anthropologist and I study economics, politics, and value in the United States. What this has practically meant is that I've studied the whys and hows of financial capitalism with an eye towards who gets rich in the US and then how the rich turn their wealth into all sorts of power. A bit more specifically than this, I have focused on processes of financialization whereby those that control the flows of wealth in society have reshaped much of the economy in their own image. This work started with a 2-year project on private equity investors in New York City, wherein I paid close attention to how and why they bought, managed, and sold the companies that they did. Private equity is interesting because these are finance people taking control of all manner of businesses, making all sorts of changes, and then selling those businesses at a profit. The crab book is the private equity book. I believe the crab is a metaphor for capitalism, though I've never been able to quite figure that out. Then I spent a few years studying employee-owned companies, which are financialized businesses where employees are actually the shareholders that control those companies. Then I spent some time organizing people to criticize neoliberal biases in business schools. That's that book. And just before the Massachusetts work, I spent 3 years on an ERC-funded group project trying to understand how financial markets had changed due to automation and electrification. Don't worry, we're getting back to legislatures. As I moved through public and private capital markets, and as I saw the whole spectrum of potential ownership from employees to distant financial professionals to anonymous capital markets, what kept coming up over and over and over again was that these various capital arrangements and assemblages were the product of often quite recent legislation and governmental policies, which is something that Katharina Pister has talked about in her book, The Code of Capital. To be a bit more specific, private equity, which at the time of my research managed about $3.8 trillion globally, private equity grew up in part due to changes in federal pension legislation in the 1970s. The law was called ERISA, the Employee Retirement Insurance Securities Act, and it allowed pensions to invest in alternative assets, to stocks and bonds, and into things like private equity. ERISA actually also had a hand in creating the tax structure that allowed the creation of employee stock ownership plan companies, which when I did my research on those accounted for a bit over 10% of the US labor force, so something like 10 to 15 million people. Then the computerization of stock markets emerged from regulatory authority nested in legislation that grew out of the Great Depression and got put into force in the 1970s and then the early 2000s. This allowed for the creation of an electronically connected national market system, which paved the way for multiple computerized financial exchanges. Without putting too fine a point on it, financial activity is downstream of laws, legislation, and legal architecture that allow it to happen. And it just so happens, too, that in the US, laws are mostly written by elected legislators, politicians that one can go and see. Due to federalism in the US, a lot of regulation of the economy happens at both the state and the national level. And given all that, I figured it was about time to do some ethnographic work on a legislature and see how and why they passed the laws that they did and why those laws might allow financial capitalism to happen. So, let's talk fieldwork. That's my pandemic long hair over there. How is it that one might learn about legislative outcomes by studying legislative cultures? As a start, I suppose one has to explain which legislature, which politicians, and why. As noted above, I studied the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. This bears a bit of explanation. Given the federal nature of the US, capitalism is regulated at both the state and the federal level. To take two examples, the regulation of national financial markets happened at the federal level with the Securities and Exchange Commission or the Commodities Futures Trading Commission. But corporate law and the regulation of corporation formation happens at the state level. Similar splits happen with labor, property, courts, and so on. So states are active sites of this impactful legislation. As to which state one could pick, there is a degree of arbitrariness here. Delaware is responsible for most nationally relevant corporate law, but beyond that, each state is a sovereign, and all of them replicate the federal institutional system of a separation of powers between a legislature, judiciary, and an executive branch. They're not parliamentary. Moreover, each state offers some version of representative democracy. Increasingly, too, political issues are nationalized in the US, so often you can expect to see state legislatures dealing with similar issues. Finally, Massachusetts is interesting for a number of reasons. John Adams wrote its constitution, which later became a model for the US federal system. It's the oldest continuously running written constitution in the world. And part of what this means is that there is a deep archival depth to draw on. Also, the US Constitution imagined a scenario in which the legislature would be the principal branch of government. And largely due to partisan division and an ever more empowered presidency, this has really never been the case at the federal level, except around odd moments like Reconstruction. However, when I studied Massachusetts, there were Democratic supermajorities in both branches of government. So when I was actually in the Senate, there were only 3 red dots. They got 1 extra red dot when someone resigned. And then this is the House of Representatives. The other thing is that as to other anthropological studies of US state legislatures, they don't really exist. So there wasn't really anything cumulative to build on within anthropology. Finally, practically, my in-laws live in Boston. So we were able to stay there while I was doing my field work, have a little extra childcare. So yeah, Massachusetts. What did I do in Massachusetts? I paid attention to Massachusetts for 3 years, roughly from January of 2022 through December of 2024, which meant that I followed the second year of the 2021-2022 legislative cycle and the full 2023-2024 legislative cycle. The Massachusetts State Legislature is a full-time legislature, and it operates on a 2-year cycle. There's actually, as an aside, a great deal of variation across the US states. Texas meets once every 2 years for like 90 days, and they don't pay their legislators very much at all. Massachusetts, by contrast, is a full-time professional legislature. In 2022, I spent 5 months in Boston, January through May, and built up an informant network via attending legislative hearings and sessions, and then asking people to talk about what I saw. I spent a lot of time at the State House, just sort of being present and dropping in as I was welcome. It was during this session that I spent a large portion of my time with the legislative clerks who facilitate legislative sessions. So with the big gavel, that's Steve James, the former clerk of the House, and it's Michael Hurley, clerk of the Senate. He's holding you can see the actual paper bills that they pass around. Like it's actually a physical analog process. He brings this tin with him every day to the, there's actually a fun detail in this picture. He also provides a script to the presiding officer because they don't really know parliamentary procedure that well. So I probably shouldn't record that bit. Okay, yeah, so that was what the first session looked like. And then showing receipts, as Anthony mentioned. This is an inventory of all the legislative sessions that I saw. So you have the date, the branch, whether I was in person and watched it over video, and whether it was formal or informal. Those are 2 different types of legislative sessions. I had 2 of those. Okay, yeah. So in 2023, I came back again in the spring and worked for a few months as a legislative fellow in Senator Jamie Eldridge's office. So that is Senator Jamie Eldridge. He is at a legislative hearing. His office does not look like that. This is like a hearing, a committee hearing, where laws are talked about by a committee of politicians before they go to the full chamber. And in this one, he tasked me with taking pictures of him. So I got to wander like up to the table and take pictures. Yeah. In this capacity, I basically did all the stuff that junior staffers did. I met with constituents, did research, joined the entourage, ran errands, and so on. And just to give a little bit of a taste of this, I don't know how well this will come out, but this is his schedule for the month of April and May when I was there. And it's all over the house. It's all over the place. 2 state house tours with constituents, dinner with constituents, watch NBA basketball playoff game with constituents, remarks at an organization's annual celebration focused on serving families who are experiencing homelessness, college reunion out of state. You know, just that's the calendar. That's what he was up to. It's packed. It just keeps going. This is the rhetorical strategy of overwhelming you via PowerPoint. The point is the quantity. That's really what we're going for here. Okay. At this point, you're probably wondering, oh yeah, there's a little bit more. While I was not on site, that's the end of the calendar, I kept in touch with key informants over the phone and email, and then followed the legislature via an insider news platform called the State House News Service, which is a fantastic service. It's a private company that's been given a concession inside the legislature to basically transcribe all the sessions and then write insider baseball that people subscribe to. And they've actually had this concession for about 100 years, and their reporters were really, really great to work with. And as is typical of ethnographic research, all of this generated a ton of textual notes as well as an eclectic archive of ephemera. Politicians generate what the British would call tat, just lots of cheap stuff. So yeah, you can see some of that. Now at this point you're probably wondering, when is he going to start talking about school lunches and what on earth does this have to do with avoidance? I'm so glad you asked. Let's set the scene. First, in late April of 2023, we are in Senator Jamie Eldridge's office. That's his office. That's his chief of staff's desk. Second, the Massachusetts State Senate is in the midst of writing their budget. Big deal for a legislature. The governor has already released her budget, step one. The House has already passed their version of the budget, step two. And now all eyes are on the Senate. If anything is not yet in the budget, not yet in the House versions of the Senate, this is the time to get it in the budget. This is the last public time the budget is going to be debated. The Senate's budget is the last public opportunity you have to get something changed, sort of. Just as a bit of information, this is how legislating works in the US. Each house of the legislature must pass an identical version of a potential law, then it has to be signed by the governor. So this is the sequence for writing budget. Governor's proposal, House budget, then Senate budget, then secret conference committee, but we can talk about that in a minute. Once the Senate budget rolls around, lobbyists, activists, local government, all of them are feverishly reaching out to their, quote, legislative champion, a term of art that people would use unironically, trying to get their priorities put in the Senate version of the budget. One thing makes this even more complicated. This was in the window between the Senate releasing their proposed budget and that budget's actual debate in the chamber. This is when you can amend the budget as a legislator. So at this point, if your stuff isn't in the published text of the Senate's budget bill, you have to get it added via a legislative amendment. And it's also likely that the chair of the Ways and Means Committee, the Budget Committee, has probably heard your request and probably affirmatively decided not to put it in. So it's tricky at this point. And just to give you some scope of this, during budget season, senators file over 1,000 amendments. So 40 senators, 1,000 amendments, you can do the mental math. There's a lot of amendment activity going on here. So this is the context in which school lunches come up. The House had passed a budget which allocated around $172 million to fund all school lunches all year in the whole state. However, the Senate's passed version of the bill did not contain this line item. No mention of school lunches. And again, for a bill to become law, the House and the Senate have to pass identical bills, and then the governor has to sign them. And as it stood, the Senate did not look as though it was going to support school lunches. All of this happened without any public explanation or debate. So let's pause and think about this for a second. The Massachusetts House of Representatives has passed a budget that funds school lunches. The Senate has proposed a budget after seeing the House of Representatives' budget, and they have not included school lunches. So if you're a citizen looking at the process, if you're a constituent watching all of this unfold, what conclusion should you draw from that? I mean, the simplest is the House of Representatives supports school lunches, the Senate doesn't. But maybe the Senate does support school lunches and thinks the House supports them so much that they can get something in negotiation with the House to include school lunches without ever risking losing school lunches. I mean, you can see how quickly things spiral in the absence of public explanation for why things are or are not in the budget. Anyway, I really don't have much more than this to go on. It's speculation. I was in the office. I don't know. So this is when I found myself in a very interesting meeting. I was in the office meeting with constituents as budget was going on. I was taking notes to relay back to the senator. And this is when I found myself meeting with constituents from an organization that I'm going to call Free From Want. It's an ethnographic pseudonym. And my job was basically to hear them out and take notes on what they said. Big picture, to the surprise of no one, Free From Want wanted Senator Eldridge to sponsor an amendment that would include school meals in the Senate budget to match the House. To do this, 3 reps from the organization came to the senator's office. They all lived and worked in his district, and they all had expert knowledge of school lunches. They made a pretty compelling case. I mean, feeding children is always, not the biggest political hurdle to get over, but their case was very persuasive. Universal free meals in schools are good for children, families, and learning. Patchwork funding of school meals or means-based funding doesn't work terribly well because there's a stigma around charity food. People get embarrassed if it's a means to. If you do this, families tend to save upwards of $12,000 per year or around $2,000 per year for kids. I thought this was very funny that they're family size of 1 to 6 children, 2,000 to 12, whatever. But yeah, you save a lot of money if you don't have to buy that food for your kid. And moreover, at schools with universal meals, kids are no longer hungry as the school day goes on, and things just work better. Who would have thought? So we talked about this for a while, and finally they asked me, Mr. Intern, would the senator file our amendment? And I said, well, yeah, the senator supports this. I don't know why this isn't in the Senate's budget. Yeah, I'll ask the senator to submit an amendment. Sure, I'll take your flyer. Didn't you guys know that sometimes the House and Senate will include or leave out things of their proposed budget to negotiate with one another when the budget goes to a closed-door conference committee? What? This was news to the activists. Do you mean to say that the Senate is negotiating with children's lunches, that cafeteria trays are bargaining chips, that the Massachusetts Senate is holding the hunger of elementary school children hostage? And these are the inferences you can start to draw if you're not on the inside of whatever this debate is. The prospect horrified the advocates from Free From Want. They shook their heads, they looked down. They recovered, though, and they said that it would be great to file something on this and get it permanently in the budget. And they thanked me for my time. Later in the day, I saw Senator Eldridge, and I told him about the meeting and their request for filing an amendment. Senator Eldridge nodded and took Free From Want's flyer. Of course he supported what they were after. Yes, he had sponsored such legislation. No, I wasn't terribly worried. He then asked me if they knew about the, quote, legislative strategy of holding this sort of thing back, end quote. I guess not. Senator Eldridge acknowledged the whole situation and more or less cops to the fact that things are getting sorted out behind closed doors. Don't worry, there's no public process to worry about anyway. The Senate is avoiding a commitment to an issue. There's no public explanation, public debate. Insofar as any explanation is offered, it's debate behind the scenes. It's some sort of thing that you don't get to see. Don't worry about it. We'll take care of it. And Senator Eldridge is avoiding public commitment, and he's not going to file an amendment for public debate. Like, that's not this process. That's not what's going on here. In fact, filing the amendment might actually perversely have the outcome of pissing off people who are going to take care of it another way. Because if they're actually holding this for debate with the House, and then you run the amendment in public, then you look like you oppose it because you're voting it down because you want to support it later behind closed doors. So the mental logic to this stuff is it can be a little perverse. So my suggestion then is that an appreciation, a bit more of a systematic appreciation of avoidance, helps us understand what is happening here. So this is sort of like how I theorize this type of an interaction. So here, a chill went through all the anthropologists in the room. So my definition of avoidance is pretty specific. So by avoidance, I mean when someone avoids some sort of an interaction because the outcome of that interaction could lead to some undesirable change in their social status or identity. So it's a structural response, or it's a structural explanation of like a personal affective response. This idea of avoidance has come from two places in anthropological theory. First is kinship studies, and it's the basic idea here coming out of old school British social anthropology was that some relationships entailed such a high degree of deference that one might as well just avoid the person one owed that deference to. A classic example would be mother-in-law avoidance. This is a classic one, right? We can talk about that in the Q&A session if you want. But anthropologists have extended this idea of avoidance all over the place to talk about things like taboos and the dead and things that might stain a person's social identity. Avoidance is interesting enough, but it's sort of a static property of a given relationship. And as an aside for the anthropology nerds in the room, this was one of the many problems with British colonial anthropology's adherence to structural functionalism. They really couldn't handle social dynamism or change. And what's really interesting to me is how relationship dynamics like avoidance compound and change over time to create certain specific sorts of socially legible people. And this is what brings me into kind of a second concept. Again, the anthropologists in the room are probably like, what is this guy doing? What is this guy doing? But this concept is schismogenesis. It's a weird, ungainly word. And it was developed by Gregory Bateson to talk through how identities are mutually co-constituted through interaction and conflict. Specifically, he suggested that you can have complementary and symmetrical schismogenesis. And so this is like you have these interactions or you have these conflicts, and your identity is informed by the conflict. So your identity is formed in relation to the people that you're interacting with. And so he suggests that with complementary schismogenesis, people become more different. So like a hierarchical relationship can produce even more stratified hierarchies if you conflict with each other and one person wins and one person loses. But you also have this dynamic where you can have symmetrical schismogenesis, where people become more similar, where the conflict or the interaction affirms equality, leveling. So there are these types of interactions that create these different sorts of relative social statuses through time. And a number of anthropologists have observed that this seems to play out specifically in political contests around binary outcomes. So when you have binary outcomes, when you have political situations or political systems that force winners and losers, this type of schismogenetic compounding seems to happen. Winners win more, losers lose more. Or if you have a system that reaffirms equality, people become more and more and more robustly equal to each other. So what I'd like to do now is show you the different sorts of avoidance that I observed, and then try and give a sense of how it ratcheted up through time. So what I'm suggesting is that there was this sort of complementary schismogenetic cycle whereby hierarchy has tended to compound on itself in Massachusetts to this point where you have very little real public confrontation, very little real public debate. And in part, it's because of the accumulation of all these avoidance interactions. At least that's the idea I want to test out and see how you respond to this. So, put another way, what I'm suggesting is that when people interact and have contests with one another, the result of these interactions have an effect on each person's relative social standing. They either become more equal or they become more hierarchically distinct. And what I'd like to illustrate is the variety of avoidance that I saw and some suggestion about how this has developed through time historically in the Massachusetts legislature. So let's start with the varieties of avoidance. So to generate this table, I went through all my field notes, my interviews, and I pulled out 165 examples of avoidance. That definition that I gave you earlier, when someone avoids some sort of an interaction because the outcome of that interaction could lead to some undesirable change in their social status. And I should note that 165 examples of this sounds like a lot, maybe, I'm not sure. But I actually excluded a lot of examples of avoidance from this because it's extremely repetitive. So to take one trivial example, in a legislative session, you will often, by unanimous consent, avoid recording votes on something. So by my definition, that's avoidance. You are not committing to having a roll call vote that someone can then call you to account for later. You're sidestepping a public confrontation because that would incrementally change your identity. And this happens all the time in a legislative session to make things more efficient. So what I'm suggesting this is just kind of an inventory of types of avoidance that I saw. Yeah. So one thing that I get that this is probably a lot to parse through, but one of the things that I find really interesting about this table is how multimodal avoidance is. It happens at the group level, it happens at the individual level, it happens at an internalized level, it's physical, it's institutionalized. And what this does is it starts to, for me at least, give a sense of what it feels like to be in the Massachusetts state legislature, what it feels like to calculate how you're meant to interact with other people. Like, the physical avoidance is one of the really interesting ones to me because people would avoid the spaces that other people were in to avoid conflicts with them. So at one point in the research, it became apparent that one of the members of leadership really didn't like me and didn't like the project that I was doing. So the solution was to physically hide me. So when the person came by the office, I would go stand behind a bookshelf. Or when I walked through the legislature, I would avoid the floor that their office was on. So there was like this kind of physicality to being like, oh, no, don't even risk any sort of a conflict with this person because it will go bad for us in a kind of a cumulative way. So I don't have time in this talk to run through most of the examples of avoidance that are in the book, and much of the book, in fact, is taken up with illustrating how avoidance practically operates. But before I move to talk about time depth, I just want to show you the table of contents and give you some sense of what is going on here. So the book starts off with the school lunch story, and then I talk about an event, an ice cream social that Senator Eldridge hosted for the Senate at his office during budget season. So this is the ice cream social. Everyone in the Senate was invited to come by the office and get some ice cream. We can talk about these types of events. They're goofy and funny and wholesome and kind of weird. But this is where I had to be physically hidden from the member of leadership. So this sort of routine social interaction, part of the social calculus was like, who do we want to see, who do we not want to see, who do we want to hide, who do we not want to hide, what sort of interactions do we want to structure? And then I talk about, come to this was an interesting one, and then I talk about a legislative push to raise the age of criminal liability in Massachusetts from 18 to 21. This is a big criminal justice reform issue, and in this chapter I talk about how Senator Eldridge was tasked with passing this through his legislative committee, but how the Senate president avoided him for months, would not talk to him, and failed to give him any support or guidance for getting this thing through committee. It ultimately led to Senator Eldridge failing to get this through committee, having a big public blow up with the Senate president, and then getting demoted in the hierarchy of committee chairs. Then I talk about a debate that happened on affordable housing and what happened when a senator got out of line and had the temerity to propose a doomed amendment that leadership did not like. What happens when someone brings up something that leadership doesn't want in the chamber and actually forces a conflict, forces people to not avoid each other. It goes really poorly for people who are subordinate. And then I zoom out and talk about legislative process. And I use a debate, this one that's pictured, on traffic safety to show how leadership strangles open debate and in fact blows things up and breaks procedural rules when it looks like things are getting out of their control, all to enforce these norms. So what you're seeing here is people debating a traffic enforcement bill. This was like literally red light stop cameras. It was not, nuclear arms control. It was not like crazy significant. But when it looked like leadership was going to lose the vote, lose the publicly recorded roll call vote, they broke the rules of parliamentary procedure, which you can see happening in this sequence. Something weird happens. The presiding officer looks back to the Senate president. The Senate president is very unhappy. And then the presiding officer cuts off debate, closes the session. And then at this point in the book, the table is basically set, and I talk about how the legislation, this culture of hierarchical deference and avoidance, creates specific laws. I talk about an entire 2-year legislation often comes down to a last-minute pissing contest between the Speaker of the House and the Senate President, often over bills that they both support. And then I talk about private equity healthcare reform, coming back to finance, and we'll end the talk with that. But for now, one other little historical thing. Here follows a truncated history of avoidance at medium depth. Nothing more on the debate. Okay. What I think makes this focus on avoidance all the more interesting is that we have a pretty good proxy for how this has developed through time via recorded votes in the chamber. As I think you may have appreciated from even my brief overview of the book, while I watched Massachusetts, there was very little substantive debate, few votes whose outcomes were not predetermined, and basically nothing that happened without the say-so of legislative leadership. The public display was extremely choreographed and meant to avoid any kind of unpredictable public confrontation. So, So to illustrate this, I want to show you 2 budget cycles that I saw, and these are the roll call votes from them. So this is the House budget debate from 2022 in Speaker Mariano's House. And so you see the roll call number, so there are about 15 roll call votes, and then you can see the vote split. And you can see they're basically all party line votes or they're unanimous. And then you can see that the Speaker of the House, was on the winning side of every single vote in the budget, every single one. So then you can see a similar thing going on with the Senate. About the same number of roll call votes, and you can see that with one exception, they're basically unanimous. So the Republicans might as well not be in the chamber for all that matters. And then, of course, the Senate president prevails in every single one of these. So, this invites awkward questions about politics, right? If this is the public record of democracy, it suggests that, everyone agrees on everything. We're doing great. I said this was somewhat historical. So the interesting thing about this is you can look back in time at previous versions of the Massachusetts state legislature and see very different types of debates that are reflected in the roll call statistics. So if you go back about 40 years to 1987, this is what the roll call vote tally looks like. Now, this is a mess. Showing tables on PowerPoint slides are very difficult. But the one thing I want to draw your attention to is that the Speaker actually loses. The Speaker of the House of Representatives loses here, loses there. The Speaker of the House of Representatives lost about 10% of the votes. This would never happen nowadays. It just would not happen. And then the other thing you see is that the vote totals are all over the place. Like, it's much more difficult to figure out what the party line is in this budget debate than the other ones I showed you. A 71-74 split, a 33-120 split, 91-55. It's all over the place, which suggests that there's a more robust debate happening in the chamber. So it was really interesting when I found this. And then, just kind of a brute force thing. They had about 100 recorded roll call votes. We were looking at budget debates that had perhaps 15 roll call votes in them. Yeah, I'll just catch up with my notes. This is what happens when you put the tables in your notes, too. Okay. So I wanted to give you a sense of some of the contextual information backing up my discussion of avoidance, how this is a process that is compounded through time. In the book, I walk through all this systematically and report on vote totals for budget debates back to 1985. And it makes the case that there were times when there were substantive public policy debates going on in the chamber where vote totals were not predetermined ahead of time and where leadership would actually lose. So there was a time when legislating was going on in the chamber. So like most things in a democracy, it doesn't seem to happen all at once either. And for the sake of brevity, that the lecture format requires, here are just some of the things that happened in that 40-year window that got us to the debates that we're seeing today. One speaker breaks norms and caucuses with the Republicans. Then a speaker gets rid of the Independent Legislative Research Bureau. Then speakers and presidents go after people who cross them in redistricting cycles, makes it harder for them to get elected again. Then leadership streamlines, for efficiency's sake, the budgeting process, such that things don't get individually voted on anymore. Rather, you consolidate amendments behind the scenes and then publicly give them an up or down vote to a packet of potentially hundreds of amendments. Then leadership reforms the legislative stipend process such that leadership controls half of the legislative paycheck. Then leadership refuses to cooperate with the auditor in the executive branch. And then leadership gets rid of term limits for legislative leaders. These are all things that happened over that 40-year period that kind of incrementally make the playing ground less and less and less even. And it has this compounding effect. Finally, it's just too difficult to contest leadership, so you don't. You get to a place where no one can figure out whether you support paying for school lunches or not. And this is a pretty classic democratic slide playing out not really at the electoral level, but in the realm of legislative rules and policy, which is also very hard to make an electoral issue. People don't tend to like thinking about insider democratic baseball. So this book spends a lot of time talking through what this looks like procedurally and how this feels to be someone trying to break out of this. And to illustrate how all this avoidance come together, I'd like to close by trying to answer that question that Americans, people from the US get when they're in Europe. Why doesn't the US have better health insurance? It's particularly interesting because most of Massachusetts actually wants better health insurance or wants socialized medicine. You can see, so one of the things you can do in Massachusetts is you can actually run non-binding polls in an election. So there are a series of nonprofits and activist organizations that run the question, like, do you want some form of socialized medicine? You can read the particular language here. And then consistently across all these districts, voters want this type of healthcare reform. And the interesting thing is that it happens in Trump districts, and it happens in districts where leadership is represented. Okay, so now that everything is set up, we've seen a bit of what avoidance looks like and how it plays out, and we've also seen some of its historical trajectory. I'll now explain how avoidance can help us understand America's terrible health insurance. As I'm sure many of you know, the US spends something like double what another comparable country spends on healthcare, about 18% of annual GDP, as opposed to a much more typical between 8 and 12%. And as I'm sure many of you know, there is no guarantee of health insurance in the US. So people either buy it or get it from their work, and this means that people can and do go without health insurance, and that people can and do go into medical debt. So it's not a great system. And one thing that's interesting about healthcare reform in the US is that Democratic politicians, since at least the time of Harry Truman in the 1940s, have been formally committed to some form of national socialized medicine. And so given that Democrats had the run of the board in Massachusetts, you'd think that that would be a great laboratory for such policy innovation.
And there was also the added benefit that the senator in whose office I sat sponsored a socialized medicine bill and was the leader of a caucus devoted to passing such a medicine bill. There's a aside we can have about Massachusetts and healthcare reform. About 20 years ago, they actually pioneered Obamacare locally in Massachusetts. So this sort of like government-regulated private healthcare marketplace actually did come out of Massachusetts, in part to head off a push for socialized medicine. But that's an aside. Okay, so to remove all suspense, in the legislative sessions that I observed, socialized medicine did not, does not, cannot, will not even get out of committee for a formal debate. There's no viable path to passing universal health care insurance in Massachusetts. This is a cartoon that one of the policy advocacy organizations would put on their literature. It says, "We tried everything, every fix the insurance company allows, but it still won't fly." And then it says the US healthcare system. Okay, so to answer this question, I found the House co-sponsor of Medicare for All, Representative Lindsay Sabadosa, and I did an interview with her. This is not where I met her, but this is what these types of events look like. This is a private members lounge at the House of Representatives, and often what you do is you get reps, senators, advocates, staffers, and they talk about a particular issue. This one happens to have the Senate president in a colorful scarf at the front of the room. So I walk into this room, and Rep. Sabadosa was sort of giving a testimonial, explaining why she supported socialized medicine. And she said, "I come to Medicare for All from a personal place. 2 years before I was elected to office, my partner passed away from cancer. The day he was diagnosed, we were told that he needed more tests, but that we had to check with insurance before we could do them at this hospital. We're not sure if you're covered. This was one of the worst moments of my life, and I didn't want to talk about health insurance. I come to this issue from a personal place. I hear these stories from my constituents who are passionate about the need to change." Really upsetting. So I did an extended interview with her on the topic, and she basically said that healthcare has not passed for the following reasons. People in the state are not ready for healthcare. People in the state do not demand universal healthcare. No one is pushing for universal healthcare. Healthcare reform is complicated and would need an impossible sequence of events to line up for it to happen, including collaboration of pharmaceutical companies, insurance companies, doctors groups, nurses groups, hospitals, and the federal government. Not much attention is paid to patients. That's an aside. Well, maybe the patients come in with this last reason that she gave me. People are used to kind of this current system, the brutality of it, and change is hard. So there's a lot of truth in all of these explanations, but what's really interesting to me is what Rep. Sabadosa did not bring up in the conversation. She said she did not bring up the opinions of relevant committee chairs who routinely reject healthcare reform bills. She did not bring up the opinion of legislative leaders who fail to advance healthcare reform legislation. She did not bring up the role of lobbying or campaign donations that interested parties may or may not play. And to this end, one of my informants sent me a list of the top lobbyists in Massachusetts, and the top three, it will not surprise you, number one, Massachusetts Association of Health Plans. Number two, Massachusetts Health and Hospital Association Incorporated. Number three, Massachusetts Biotechnology Council. Those are the top three lobbyists in the state of Massachusetts. So after doing this interview, I went and did some interviews with healthcare advocates that I'd gotten to know, and they were equal parts amused, horrified, and familiar with Rep. Sabadosa's somewhat avoidant and blame-shifting answers. They told me that they regularly run opinion ballot questions on healthcare. This is what I started the section on. Often in conservative districts, and large majority of voters always support socialized medicine, even in districts that supported Trump. So much for the change being scary. The advocates also told me a lot about how they are systematically shut out of the legislative process via legisplaining. This is politicians browbeating people with procedural arcana that makes them go away. Oh, we just need to get it in front of this committee leader. Oh, well, see, we have to have a hearing first before we can advance this bill. So just, get ready and testify at the hearing. The advocates all call this legisplaining, and they really resent it. And it really annoys them. And so, one advocate, when I was talking to him about all this, he says to me, "I find it very hard after a number of re-elections to get even the most progressive people to admit that the legislature is a dictatorship. And that sooner or later, this is the way of the world. You got to kiss up to the leaders. They can't admit that this is really bad. They say things like, this time is bad, or you've got to talk to so-and-so first. They might admit indirectly, and they'll point you to leadership. They'll say, go meet with Cindy Friedman, the chair of healthcare financing. I say, we already did. It's buck passing." So leadership is great at avoiding any sort of accountability for healthcare reform, and this trickles down to rank and file folks like Rep. Sabadosa, notwithstanding her tragic backstory. Politicians are great at avoiding any formal votes or procedural action that would back healthcare. They fended off any sort of public commitment, debate, anything like that. And advocates are stuck in a buck-passing vortex. The whole thing would be funny were it not for the stakes involved. While I was finishing up my fieldwork, a chain of private equity-owned hospitals went bankrupt. Just let that phrase sit in your head, a chain of private equity-owned hospitals. It went bankrupt, they discontinued care, and they killed a bunch of people. Far from any sort of a reckoning, the best the state managed to do was to add some investment supervision requirements to its healthcare regulatory apparatus. The governor, Maura Healey, was actually quoted in the Boston Globe, the paper of record in Massachusetts, saying, quote, "I did all that I could. I did all that I could do." Okay, so at this point, I hope we see how politicians avoid voting, debating, policy commitments, challenging leadership, etc., and how this often puts them out of step with basic priorities of their voters. More to the point, it also makes it impossible in a routine way to figure out why something does or does not pass, and who does or does not support a given bill, policy, or law. And I hope that we've seen how this has ratcheted up over time, and that this is a specific historical precipitate and not something essential to how democracies have to operate. So what I'd like to do in closing is walk through some of the ideas for how to unstick and unavoid democratic culture in Massachusetts. And so this is the last chapter of the book. And honestly, it's been a bit of a bear to write because most anthropologists are not trained on giving policy advice or doing applied research. So what I've tried to do in these recommendations is think, okay, my diagnosis has been a very specific kind of social anthropological analysis of these interactional dynamics. What could you do to actually break those dynamics iteratively and make the democracy produce more equal interactions between people? And so that's what I'm trying to do. So there's a section on culture reforms. And so just to give one example, legislate in the chamber. Very basically, have substantive debate in the chamber. As it stands now, there are private legislative caucuses that no one has access to, not staff, not journalists, where things are basically decided ahead of time, and then what happens in the chamber is kind of a pro forma ratification of that private agreement. So if you were to legislate in the chamber, you would actually see what the points of disagreement are. But if you did that, you'd expose people to taking policy commitments that they lose on. So it doesn't fit with the current logic of the place. So share the work. Don't hoard the work in leadership. Allow people to participate more broadly in the legislative process. Elect leaders who value democracy. I mean, this sounds very insubstantial when I put it up here in bullet points, and maybe it is. But the members of the Massachusetts State Legislature are in the interesting position of being able to elect their bosses. And so you just need 21 people in the Senate to pick someone who likes democracy or wants a more open debate. Stop legislating. Stop having contempt for your electorate. A shift in ethics on the part of elected politicians. Often politicians in Massachusetts are very parochial, very focused on their district, as they should be. But there's rarely this sort of reflection that I'm also a representative of this democratic system writ large. And so my actions contribute to how people feel about this larger system. A photo. So then, once I kind of get that kind of cultural groundwork out of the way, because I really think there needs to be some sort of a shift in mindset. And I developed this in the book through questions you could ask that kind of push this. I get to specific rules reforms. So rules reforms are also kind of easy, because in the Senate, you just need to get 21 people to agree, and then you change the rules. In the House, you need 81 people to agree, and you change the rules. So break the stranglehold of supercommittees. Right now, the committee structure has 2 or 3 superordinate committees that everything gets filtered through, and they can just make it a graveyard. So any bill that has potentially $10,000 or more effect on the state's finances goes to the Ways and Means Committee. The Ways and Means Committee writes the budget. But you can make a justification that almost any bill you pass will cost the state $10,000 directly or indirectly. So it goes to Ways and Means and it dies. Right? That's a classic bottleneck in the committee process. Have blind ballots for committee chairs and chamber leadership. Right now, the Senate president and the Speaker of the House just pick the chairs. They get elected and they pick the chairs. Nebraska, a very interesting state in the United States, has a one-house legislature. They just have a Senate, and they elect their committee chairs and chamber leadership via blind ballot. So different processes are possible in this type of context. Right now, it's an exercise of raw power on the part of leadership. Professionalize the staff, right? One of the things I mentioned is they killed the Independent Legislative Research Bureau, right? The staff are professional in that, like, they like their jobs and they try to do good at them, but there's comparatively little institutional support for staff sticking around for a long period of time and actually being able to be competent participants in the legislative process. Senator Eldridge's office had a coup in having hired someone who got burned out on corporate law and just wanted to be a staffer. And so all of a sudden we had this expertise in the office that was amazing from like a legal analytic point of view, but that's not typical. Depoliticize the Speaker and the Senate President. Make the offices more ministerial, like the legislative clerks. These are all incremental ways to chip away at the structures that kind of produce these avoidant relationships. And then there's some bigger picture legal changes. Now, changes to the Massachusetts state laws are hard, right? It's a difficult legislative process, but there actually is a referendum process in Massachusetts that has had success in passing things that the legislature does not like. So you could reduce the number of bills that come to the State House. One thing that was cited to me over and over again is something like 6,000 bills come to the Massachusetts State House every year. Part of the reason that happens is because Massachusetts has just decided that every change in local liquor laws has to go through the legislature. Or every time you allocate a sick leave bank to a chronically ill Massachusetts state worker, you have to have an act of the state legislature. So the legislature fills up with lots of local stuff that really should not demand the attention of the legislature of the state. Apply open meeting laws to the legislature. Right now, open meeting laws don't apply to the Massachusetts state legislature. Endorse a legislative leader on your ballot line. So maybe this is a way to actually politicize what goes on in the electoral arena, what's going on in the State House. So like if you had to make a commitment that I'm going to vote for this person as legislative leader, that would become part of your election campaign, and you'd have to defend it. I don't know. Changes to the Massachusetts Constitution. Abolish one house of the legislature. One huge structural piece of hiding the legislative process is the committee process. So when the houses of the legislature disagree with each other, they can create a conference committee that meets in secret. So if you get rid of one house of the legislature, you get rid of the conference committee. And this was actually some of the progressive justification for Nebraska doing that back in the 1920s. No wasted votes. You could imagine some sort of a proportional representation system, because right now it's a winner-take-all system. And then these are pie in the sky. I'm sure everyone has some inkling how difficult it is to change the US Constitution. It's basically impossible at this point. But again, some sort of proportional system where you actually have possibility for party entrepreneurship. And then, you know, the last one's kind of hard. Okay, let me give you a coda. So in the time since I ended my fieldwork, a charismatic auditor, which is a state-level executive position that's elected alongside the governor, and a number of other. Massachusetts has a bunch of them. They have a governor, a lieutenant governor, an attorney general, a secretary of state, and an auditor. There might be one that I'm missing. So she won. She's the auditor, and she's a former legislator who was really pissed off at the Massachusetts legislature, and she's made her agenda to audit the legislature. Like, where are they debating? Why are they debating? How are they spending their money? So we have a kind of a classic constitutional showdown going on. And she's actually had success championing some ballot propositions. So she got a ballot proposition passed that said that the auditor explicitly has the power to audit the legislature. This go around, she's advancing one that would apply open meeting laws to the legislature. So there's a real good chance that that will pass because she is championing. And as I mentioned before, this kind of direct democracy, the initiative, which came to Massachusetts in the progressive era in like the 1920s, 1910s, it has allowed the state to pass bills that the legislature never would pass. So things like the legalization of marijuana, pushing back on charter schools, and there are some other wildly popular proposals on the ballot this cycle, like introducing rent control. The Democrats still have their supermajority, and the federal government grows ever more hostile. What should Massachusetts do? How should its democracy change? To answer these and many other questions, you'll have to read Avoiding Democracy in Massachusetts. Thank you.